Oh, we are up. Okay.
We're up.
We are going.
We're live.
Sorry, guys. We've been ironing out some technical uh, issues trying to get this ready so that we can bring energy fellow Ed Hers from the University of Houston on, our energy expert, to talk about this testimony that's happening before the House Oversight Committee. We've got executives from 4 oil companies talking about climate change and what they've done or haven't done, and lawmakers grilling them for hours now. Ed, I wanted to ask so far what your biggest takeaway has been.
Well, there's a lot of theater here, Brandi, and so the both sides in Congress are full of misinformation, misperceptions. What they're trying to deal with, if we step back and take the most objective and sober view that we can, for more than a dozen years, the electorate, all of U.S. voters, by a margin of 76%, have been in favor of reducing emissions, cleaning up the environment. That includes Republicans and Democrats. The whole issue has always been who's going to pay for it and how are we going to pay for it? And the realization has finally kind of set in that it's going to be the consumer. But wait, the consumer is the voter. But wait, the voter is the consumer. So you see where I'm going with this. The political calculus for Congress, for any elected official, is that they don't get reelected if the price goes up at the pump or at the electricity meter. And here in Texas, we're facing both of those right now. And most of this is due to the fact that no one had the political integrity to stand up and take action sooner, earlier. Waxman-Markey was passed by the House in 2009. The Senate and President Obama did not want to take it up. That would have instilled a carbon pricing mechanism at that point. But the problem was we were in the Great Recession. And to have done that would have increased the expenditures across America at a time of economic recession. And of course, that means that no one would be reelected. But if we had done that in 2009, these hearings never would have happened. The political theater is mainly for scoring points. This is the way it always is in Washington. And so we just have to kind of step back and say, well, if we're going to reduce carbon, how do we do this? The best way is going to be to put it into the consumer's hands, which means the consumer's got to decide with his and her pocketbooks. And so that will happen with a carbon tax or a carbon pricing mechanism, a cap and trade.
But for a carbon tax to be implemented, that's really an action that Congress would need to take.
Absolutely. That has to come from Congress.
Oh. Good morning. Ed is home. He has his dog there. The dog who's learned that if he barks at the right time, he can get some treats. That's a smart dog you've got.
Yeah, he's trained me very well.
That's how it works. But as I said, Congress is really the body that needs to act. If we're talking about a carbon tax, if we're talking about taking action, it boils down to Congress doing something, because individuals aren't going to walk up to the gas station and say, hey, man, here's an extra 89 cents per gallon that I just filled up with.
Well, and that's exactly right. So during the hearings, they were talking about what would be an appropriate carbon tax. In California right now, the low carbon fuel credit trades is almost as high as $200 a metric ton. So that works out to about $1.90 per gallon of a credit for those companies that produce renewable fuel, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, for example. The analysis that I ran a couple of years ago brought this to the consumer level. If we put $100 a metric ton tax on CO2 emissions, that would get us to 89 cents a gallon at the pump for gasoline and diesel. If all of a consumer's electricity were to come from a coal-fired plant, that would add $100 to $200 a month to the electricity bill from that particular plant. That's less of an issue in Texas. Our portfolio is not heavily stressed or pushed weighted towards coal. and again, this is something that has to come from Congress. There has to be leadership. The science behind climate change, global warming, CO2 emissions hasn't changed from my 1964 physics textbook that we used in high school. That's been well known, and the rest of it has been political theater to determine who's going to pay for it and how it's going to impact the voters. The impact in terms of social justice, if we think about ESG, really falls on the poor, because for them, transportation, fuel is a much larger proportion of their personal expenditures every day. They need their cars to get to work. We have gone away from mass transit. In 1982 in Houston, we passed the light rail referendums, but it was another 20 years before anything started to be built. We've one man, one horse, one man, two cars. This is the way it's been in Texas and to a lesser extent across the rest of the nation. And, we rely upon carbon intensive fuels. If we had gone down this road in 2009 or sooner, had given the economic incentives for reducing carbon, for carbon capture, sequestration, carbon reuse, these hearings wouldn't have happened.
When you talk about it being political theater, there have been quite a few comparisons between this and the nicotine or the tobacco executive hearings in the 90s. But you were sharing this is a little different than what Congress was doing then.
That's absolutely right, and the Surgeon General's warnings about tobacco and use came out in the 50s, and finally in the 90s we began to see some action. This type of process takes a long time, but keep in mind this is kind of a false analogy. The tobacco companies, the cigarette manufacturers, they weren't exactly the same as the oil companies. If we were to draw a more accurate parallel, we would have GM, Ford, and what used to be known as Chrysler defending themselves.
Yeah, this is akin to like bringing the tobacco farmers up.
No, this is very close to that. And again, we have to keep in mind, well, what's the parallel with the drug companies? We've just been through the opiate lawsuits, and there's no question that these medications wreaked havoc for a small portion of society, but had a tremendous benefit for folks who absolutely needed pain relief following surgeries or major traumas, and who were not otherwise addicted. There's a cost-benefit analysis to all of these equations.
If you guys are just joining us, we are talking to Energy Fellow Ed Hers of the University of Houston. He has an audience at home there, a pup. But we're talking about the hearings, testimony that's happening today. Executives from 4 oil companies in front of the House Oversight Committee, and what we've been discussing is a lot of political theater, because these lawmakers are hammering the executives, asking why they haven't done more to combat climate change, to combat fossil fuels. But really, when we're talking about implementing those kind of changes, Ed, you said it comes down to the consumer, possibly a carbon offset tax, something like that, which falls as a responsibility to Congress.
That's right. This takes political leadership and political integrity. Several of the industry participants, they stumbled themselves, and keep in mind that scientists, engineers, geologists may not be the most glib and articulate in the business. Not to say that economists are any better, but our analysis back in 2012 on the arithmetic of shale gas showed that by dropping the price of natural gas from $11 per thousand cubic feet to $4 per thousand cubic feet at that time, added about $100 billion in wealth to the consumer side on an annual basis. When I updated this paper in January of 2020, with including not only the arithmetic of fracking for gas, but for oil, it provides a net gain to the U.S. economy of about $200 billion a year. And that's something that Secretary Yellen has pointed out as a real benefit.
Well, Wade just commented on our Facebook page. I think when we talk about consumers sort of taking on that cost of a carbon tax, for example, per gallon, Wade says big oil needs to cut the high profits and all the perks they get. I think there's a lot of frustration that we see the profits that oil companies make, and then the question is, well, wait a minute, why do we have to be the ones to pay?
Well, the oil companies are owned by a lot of our retirement accounts. Keep in mind that there are profits this year. Last year, there weren't many profits at all. The price of oil goes negative. And these profits are certainly there. But if you add, subtract, multiply, and divide, it's what's required to earn a return on capital. A lot of the theater today was pointed at U.S. supplies, and with the conceit that if we cut down U.S. production, we'll lower our carbon footprint. Well, that is a conceit. That's a lie, because that hasn't changed our behavior. When the leading vehicle in the United States is a Ford F-150, the consumer's not quite ready to face the facts. And we would continue to import that crude. We've not been energy independent. That was one of the myths that was bandied around. We, all through the so-called energy independence, we've been importing 7 million barrels a day of crude oil because we need that to match up with our refineries. And so there's hyperbole, misstatements, spin from both sides of the aisle.
That's an interesting juxtaposition, because you mentioned earlier that something like 76% of Americans want to reduce emissions, and yet we're out there making Ford F-150 the most popular vehicle on the roads. So there seems to be a disconnect between what we want to see happen and what we are willing to do to get there.
Exactly. When the price of oil hit $147 a barrel in the summer of 2008, the most popular vehicles sold were the Toyota Tercel, the Honda Civic, another little tiny Nissan. Folks could actually park their Dodge Rams, their Silverados and F-150s in the parking lot, go buy a new car and save money. And that's what it's going to have to come down to. We're going to have to put a pricing mechanism on the consumption of fuel according to the carbon content. We have to make a discrete break. The linear trends are not going to be enough as they currently stand, even following all of the Paris Agreement projections and accords. We're not going to get there. This is going to require some real heavy lifting across the world. We're seeing an implementation of this in the EU with a carbon border tax. Now, this is built on Nobel Prize winner William Nordhaus's Climate Club paper, where he proposed a plan whereby countries would adapt some sort of carbon reduction mechanism. There are a couple of ways to do this, with carbon pricing, a carbon tax, cap and trade, or just an out-and-out restriction by fiat. You're not going to burn more than X gallons of oil a day, or bazillion tons of coal. And for those countries that do, then they are part of the club. And for those countries that don't, then they're charged a 3% tariff on all goods, not just carbon intensive goods, but across all of them, which makes the accounting a whole lot easier. And the EU is looking at this and calling it a carbon border tax. This is a bone of contention right now in the EU. Germany has been lauded for its massive solar energy development, and the fact that they export solar energy across parts of Europe. But they are also one of the largest users of coal for electricity, and this has continued to increase over the last several years. Big article in the Washington Post about that over the weekend. And so, we have aspirations. The aspirations are for a cleaner environment and making as much progress as possible. And in democracies, the question is, how are we going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for it? And on what terms? And this is the sausage making part of Congress right now.
Aspirations are all well and good, but if there are no actions to get you there, then that's all they are.
That's absolutely true. And the committee chair today has been in Congress since 1993. And I think, she was certainly expressing a lot of frustration in her statements and questions today.
One of the things I did find interesting was there was no argument from any of the oil execs about global warming, about climate change. They all acknowledged that it is an issue that they are grappling with. There were accusations from lawmakers that it's basically just a talking point for them, that they're not walking the walk along with talking the talk, but for those acknowledgments to come from all of the major executives of oil companies, that seems significant.
I think it is, but keep in mind the oil and gas climate initiative has been around for more than 10 years. This is comprised of a consortium of the major oil companies globally. They've all acknowledged climate change. They've all acknowledged that they need to do something about it, and they've all been through this group pushing forward with the George Shultz, Jim Baker revenue neutral carbon tax approach, which is the idea that we would apply a carbon tax across the economy and across the world globally, but have rebates to those individuals who pay more than their share, if you will.
I know this is going to get a lot of attention. These hearings are going to get a lot of attention in the energy capital in Houston.
Yes.
For obvious reasons. But outside of Houston, I don't know if there's that focus. I don't know that folks are sitting here watching this testimony for hours. Are there any key headlines or key points that you think folks need to look for, as like if you have to really narrow it down to like three headlines to come out of this, what consumers need to know?
Yes, we're going to be paying more for fuel soon. I can't tell you if it's this administration or the next one. We need to be making plans for that. You may want to think twice before you buy a gas guzzler now. But keep in mind, this has got to be a gradual transition. The average age of the American automobile fleet is about 12 years, the same with the heavy truck fleet. That means that we're not going to have any wholesale changes over the next 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years. It's going to take a decade to get there. We've got other concerns, obviously, with grid stability and a lack of investment. And again, this is not red or blue or Democratic or Republican. We've got problems in Texas, the same as California has. And so we're having to deal with that. And that's just going to cost us more. Keep in mind that paying for energy is not a tax on the economy. It's very necessary for us to actually operate the economy.
Wonderful. Was there anything else that you wanted to add before we let you get back to it?
Well, it's very disappointing to see the level of energy literacy displayed by this congressional committee. Republicans and Democrats, and even the API, they have it's distressing. And,
I know.
There's a further comment. He's been listening all day too.
Those are his 2 cents, huh?
Exactly.
Well, I know you spoke with our reporter Jason Miles, and he has a story coming up later tonight on KHU 11 News. And of course, we'll have that story on khbu.com as well. Thank you, as always, for taking the time and joining us for this conversation.
My pleasure, Brandi. Thank you.